This is Talk to Seattle, and I'm your host, Jason Rigden. On this episode of the show, we have Naveed Jamali, who's running for Seattle City Council in the 7th District. How are you today?
Hey, Jason, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself, maybe your background and experience?
Sure. Why don't I jump right into telling you a little bit about why I'm running, and it kind of blends into my background. I like many relatively new Seattleites. I'm a transplant. My wife and I came here about 3 years ago. My wife is a senior staff scientist at the Fred Hutch, and we really moved to Seattle sight unseen. Picked a place, just looking on the internet, rented it, and moved our family, my two young boys and myself, and her out here. And after being here a couple of years, we really like it. I mean, this is a place that I think has a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential just as for growth, but not in many different ways. And part of that is to sort of make this a city that, that is embracing of change. I think that a lot of the folks that have come here, as a former East Coaster, this idea of a melting pot, I really believe that this is something that Seattle can embrace. And, we're bringing a lot of people from different areas of the world and different areas of life. And I think it's a wonderful thing. So my background prior to that is when we moved here, I was working at MSNBC. I was an intelligence analyst. So after spending 2 years covering the Trump administration, the chaos and horror that is our federal government right now, and on top, coupled with the fact that I have a background in Russian counterintelligence and, being called to brief the House Intel Committee by the Democrats and showing up to D.C. and then getting promptly boycotted by Devin Nunes and the Republicans in Congress on the House Intel, I just sort of felt that the federal government reached this level of impasse. And being on TV and covering this and every day saying, today is the worst day ever, it can't get any worse, and then subsequently the next day coming on and saying the same thing, it sort of burnt me out. So when I heard that the open secret of Sally Bagshaw, who's the departing incumbent of District 7, was not going to run, I really, it sort of struck me. I mean, going from the national stage to the local stage, I felt that was a real opportunity to impact people's lives in a very, very positive way. And, when I think about local politics, this is something that really has much more of a throughput and much more of a connective tissue to most residents, to most citizens. And, I think that is a huge challenge. It's an exciting one. It's one where we can bring some really great ideas. And equally important, I think we can have real progress, real tangible progress. So, my background is admittedly eclectic, but I want to bring that sort of way of thinking, the idea that this is about new ideas, this is about change, and change can happen and should happen at the local level. It's perhaps the one that really has the most impact. So, that's a very quick overview of who I am, why I'm doing this. And, to me, this is all about bringing new ideas, a different perspective to a city that's meant to be inclusive.
And could you tell me a little bit about your district?
So the 7th District, I would argue, is perhaps the most important. We have 90,000 residents. It includes a host of different industries. Look, it's also one of the largest districts that has renters. We have a large portion of renters. We are, from Magnolia to Queen Anne to Belltown to all the way downtown. This is the sort of modern-day breadbasket of Seattle. It's also a district that, in addition to just the sheer number of people that live here, it's one that swells in size every day as we get people that commute into the city and into this district. We have a huge tourism industry of about $5 billion, and most people stay, whether it's the cruise lines, whether it's staying in hotels, hospitality is huge in this district. So it's also the place that's got it going through some of the largest growth and change, where there's a majority of the cranes are here. So it's a really interesting district in that it's part of it is sort of suburban, single family homes, but a good chunk of it is, the core of downtown Seattle. And it's a really interesting place. I think it's one where, you sort of see the future of Seattle, how things are going to move. But I would argue that District 7 is arguably the, and perhaps I'm biased, but it's arguably the most important district in the city.
And what are some of the biggest challenges facing your district?
I think you would ask residents and they would tell you that they feel that there are several challenges. And I want to be careful. So there's district challenges and there's city challenges. I think that there's a lot of overlap between the two, right? So Obviously, one of the first things people point to is housing. We are a $400 billion economy. We are the 11th largest city per GDP. We are a big city. We're not a small collection of small towns. But this is something that our identity has been for a very long time been small towns, a collection of sort of these small, growing towns that have been interconnected. And I think that is something that we as Seattleites are going to have to tackle. And what I mean, this is exactly when it comes to single family houses, when we talk about density, how do we, I live in Queen Anne. There is a large question of how we build density. Everyone acknowledges that there is a need for housing. How do we do it? Where do we do it? How do we do it in a way that doesn't disrupt what is today a large single-family neighborhoods? How do we do it in a way that we build density that is connected to services, that doesn't overwhelm existing services? That I think is probably one of the biggest issues. And of course, you have a lot of concern about. And I hate to use the term homeless because I think it's far too broad of a topic. Homelessness, transportation. How do we? A full third of Seattleites live 15 minutes away or more from frequent mass transit. So there's transportation. There's certainly a concern about crime and public safety. And I would just say that a lot of the questions that Seattle and the district face are really just nuts and bolts infrastructure questions. And how do we expand the infrastructure to accommodate the influx of people and the projected continued influx of people? How do we change the demographic that's coming here so that this isn't just a transitory stay? This isn't somewhere where someone who comes at 25 for a few years and then leaves, but instead comes here for their first job, perhaps, with their family and stays here because it's a great city to stay and raise a family and retire and go through all the different life changes. So, that's what we want to focus on. How do we, and that is something that I think is not just exclusive to the district, but certainly something that most Seattle residents would agree is our priorities.
And how can the city help homeless folks?
Well, I think the first thing to do is we say homeless folks. We got to define what we mean by homeless folks because there's a very, very different large criteria. When you ask the average resident, when you say homeless, I think most people are going to think of someone living in a tent or an RV. And that's just not the case. A large portion of people who we would define homeless are those who are at the top part of this. It's someone who is living in subsidized housing, living in an MHA. It's oddly enough, I've talked to people who live on houseboats. Technically, that's not considered because of the weird Seattle code. So homeless as a category, it's important to define where are we focusing this energy. I would say the large part of the effort here, that effective effort, can be put in prevention. So it's really hard to argue when someone is the victim of domestic violence, a single mother, and she's just left an abusive relationship. The husband is now in jail, but he was the breadwinner. So him in jail, her protecting her family, she's in a position where she can't make rent. We just had a snowstorm. If the buses don't run and you're someone who works an hourly job, guess what? That can have a huge impact on your ability to make rent. If it's 8 or 9 days, you're not making up those lost wages. So it's not telecommuting. If you're, cleaning hotel rooms or you're working as a barista, those are lost wages. So I think all of us would agree that focusing on areas like that, where it's helping someone stay out of homelessness, this preventive approach, is just events, having services that are available there, having ways to identify those issues before they drive someone to homelessness. And look, the longer someone is homeless, the more expensive and the more difficult it is to sort of reverse the trend. So that's clearly one part. The other part is we talk about mental illness. Washington State as a whole has some of the most difficult laws when it comes to involuntary commitment. And, I spend time in Pioneer Square. I spend time doing outreach with case managers. I am very frustrated and upset with sort of the approach that this, not just this city, but the country has towards mental illness. When you go downtown and you're in Pioneer Square and you see someone who is just not lucid, it's very clear that they're not able to take care of themselves. And, I've talked to case managers, and interestingly enough, one of the biggest problems case managers point to about helping people like that is not a lack of money, which is, of course, always a problem, but rather getting them an ID so they can get into the system. When someone isn't lucid, the requirements for getting a Washington state ID are set by the federal government. They're only going to become more onerous as we go to enhanced ID. These are things where it becomes a bureaucratic process so they can get an ID, so you can get them on Medicare, Medicaid, so you can get them registered in programs, and these are just barriers. So, when we think about how we can help them, I think the first part is to correctly explain what we mean by homeless and to understand that not every solution fits every use case, that it's a misnomer, and in fact, it does more damage just to put everyone under one bucket and say there's going to be one solution, that it's just about housing or it's just about drug treatment or just about mental health care. It's not. It really has to be separated into a service and approach that fits the individual, that fits the need of what the underlying problem is. And I'll also say this, look, I'm a former East Coast guy. September 11th was a defining moment for me. It's why I joined the military, again, as a former New Yorker, and this idea of, the melting pot, acceptance and tolerance is something I grew up with. Both my parents are immigrants. My mother's French. My father's Pakistani. September 11th had a huge imprint for me. I was living in Boston at the time, but I was down at the World Trade Center a few days after September 11th. And it defined me, and I know, and really marked my life. And I'll say this to anyone, that talks about homelessness has to enter part of the problem, the equation, which is there are bad people in this world. There just are. And no matter what services you provide, no matter what outtake you want to extend, there are bad people. And if anyone doubts that, there are 3,000 families of victims of 9/11 that I can introduce you to who will tell you about evil. And I'm not saying that I want to dehumanize anyone, but it's important that we understand that there are people out there that we need a police force that is going to do enforcement, that's going to protect us. And there are people, unfortunately, who should not be in circulation. That's just the nature of society. And I think that if we whitewash that and we push that aside, we really do ourselves a disservice. And we specifically do a disservice to the overwhelming majority of people who want help and can be helped. And I think that's really important. So that's sort of my approach to, how we tackle homelessness.
Another big issue in the city is transportation. What do you think the city can do to help improve that?
So I'm very proud of the fact that we've released a transportation policy. I'm very, very much someone who is a policy wonk, and we focused on that quite a bit. My sort of standing order for our policy team is we're going to write policy so that while I don't anticipate it, even if I'm not elected, the policy will be so good that someone can pick it up and implement it. So for transportation, everyone, again, whether it's alternative transportation, bike activists, anyone you speak to agrees that to commuters, to motorists, that the future is going to be mass transit. We all understand this. The issue today is that it is not here in place today. It's not going to be here tomorrow. It's not going to be here next week. It's not going to be here next month. So we have to have some common sense solutions in the interim. And that's what I focused on. So we started on Mercer, for example. And one of the simple ideas that we came up with is something that other cities, 8 other major cities implement. When it comes to rush hour, we know where the choke points are in the city, 8 to 10 in the morning, Monday through Friday, 4 to 6, again, in the afternoon, Monday to Friday. And the idea that we're proposing, part of this transportation plan, is to take parking enforcement officers, make them transportation officers, not police officers, and actually install them at choke points to make sure the traffic can move fluidly and continuously to and from I-5, make sure emergency vehicles can get through, that lanes aren't blocked, make sure that pedestrians and bicyclists can cross safely. And it's just such a simple, common sense, low-hanging fruit. Is it going to alleviate congestion? No. Is it going to, remove the need for mass transit? Absolutely not. But it will make the streets safer. It will make them more efficient. And it's a reason. This is not reinventing the wheel. There are other cities that are doing this every day of the week during rush hour. Just something we could change. And, we looked at how to do it. Right now, Seattle has a sort of arcane law that says only police officers can override traffic control devices. And this is something that, as a city council member, I can change, with a stroke of a pen. This is something that we can change and allow traffic enforcement officers to have the same ability. They can't write tickets, but they can direct traffic. I think, again, low-hanging fruit, almost immediate impact. If you've ever been on Mercer during rush hour, you understand how beneficial it would be to help ease congestion, especially as Google and other places move on to Mercer, this is something we can do. The other thing that we're looking at is how we can leverage connector buses, and can we move standard drop-off and pickup spots for something like Amazon for ride shares. So I mean, there's a lot of small things that we can do today that will be aimed at alleviating traffic. The reality is, for the immediate future, cars are going to play a large part of people's methodology and just reliance on commuting in daily life until we have an infrastructure that really is truly one that has mass transit.
Another issue that seems to be on everybody's mind is housing affordability. What do you think the city can do to improve that?
Well, again, the same thing. We say affordability. What does that mean? I would argue that if you have a below market or subsidized rental unit, and it's in the middle of nowhere with no access to transportation or schools, it's not truly affordable. So the first part of this is to look at what we mean by affordable. And I would say it has to include a 360-degree view. Look, the other part is housing for families. It's one thing if you have MHAs that are one bedroom, but we have a growing family population. People with, 2 adults and 1 or 2 children need 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. And that is perhaps, when we talk about the city, this is something, it's not just affordable housing. I want to see housing built for families. This is, when we think about density, let's not just build 1 bedroom or studios. Let's start building stuff so that families can stay here, so they don't have to keep moving further and further away from Seattle. That's perhaps a big chunk of this. And I fully support that, as selfishly, as someone who has 2 young children, and we would love to be able to make sure that there's a dearth of supply for housing for families.
So we live in very polarized times. How would you, as a city leader, work to bring people together?
So this is what I do. I am very much the running joke that I would always say is that, growing up as the son of 2 immigrants was a challenge for as long as I can remember in trying to fit in. I mean, I've written a book about my life. And while that book has to do with my 3 years working for the FBI as a double agent against Russian intelligence, a lot of it has to do with truly what it means to be an American and identity. And I joke about the fact that because I didn't really belong exclusively to one identity, I was always able to sort of make friends with different groups. And to that point, if there was a group dedicated to the overthrow of Naveed Jamali, I could probably join. I wouldn't be the president, but I might be the treasurer. And I think that's been my approach, is even now, as we put together policy, I've reached across the aisle with people that I don't always agree with and who don't always agree with me, but we sat down and we sussed out enough things that we found common ground. And the transportation policy is a perfect example. And our sort of additionally forthcoming policy is another one. But this is how you do it, is when you build policy, the idea is to focus not on differences, but on consensus. This isn't about ego or personal vanity. Again, I've been on national TV. I've had my ego stroke. Those days are behind me. I want to write good policy, and I want to implement good policy. And the best way to do that is to build consensus, to build a consortium, to reach across, I don't want to say the aisle, but reach across the ideological aisle, perhaps, for opposing views. And if you can find overlap, which surprisingly, I have to tell you, I have not met with a group where there isn't something that we leave a meeting with or we agree on, and a fundamental part of that. So how I would run as a city councilman is exactly what I'm doing now, which is meeting with as many people, and not just to meet with them, not to just say that I met with them as a stakeholder, but to solicit ideas, to give them my ideas, to get the review, to get a dialogue, and to find that middle ground. And when we find that middle ground, that's what I want to focus on. That's been my style for as long as I've lived. It's what I'm doing right now, and exactly the way that I would push forward as a city council member.
And if people want to learn more about your campaign, where should they go?
You can hit my website, Naveed, that's Naveed, for Seattle.com. You can certainly follow me on Twitter, Naveed, at Naveed Jamali. But the website's a great place. I'm an active Twitterer, so you can certainly hit me up there. And we are doing a number of events. Stay tuned. Happy to have people out. And look, most importantly, I'm always eager to entertain questions. I'm always eager to have a dialogue. In fact, when I go out on the street and we do our doorbells or we walk from business to business, one of the things that my minders always get frustrated is that I will sit and talk to someone for as long as they need. And I really genuinely feel that. I think that the good news is I am a Seattle neophyte. I'm an outsider, but that means that I do not have any preconceived notions. And I have to tell you, Jason, that doing this, talking to people, has changed my mind in so many instances, things that I wasn't even aware of, things that I hadn't considered. And that's okay. That's the way it should be. You shouldn't come in and say, this is my idea. I'm never going to depart to it. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have a moral compass or any ideological beliefs, but I think it's important to have this dialogue. So I certainly welcome people reaching out to me. I always welcome an exchange of ideas. I also say that we don't always have to agree, but we can respect each other. And I believe that. I'm not always going to agree with people. They certainly don't always have to agree with me, but I want them to at least know that I've taken what they've said seriously. I've listened to them. I've considered it. And I'm very serious about that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You got it.